We've been studying the last few weeks on mainly speaking about spiritual gifts and things surrounding that. In chapters 12, 13, and 14, Paul is dealing with spiritual gifts and different aspects and attitudes toward those gifts. In particular, we have been looking the last 2 or 3 weeks in chapter 14. I think this is our third week to study chapter 14. I'm not for sure that we'll finish chapter 14 this morning, but I think we will kind of move past the spiritual gift aspect of the chapter there. And so, Lord willing, we will finish up this morning talking about the tongues and the gifts and things of that nature. As we were finishing up last week, we were looking at verse 26 and looking at the purpose of worship. And in particular, Paul is discussing here, a lot of the chapter is used to discuss the use of spiritual gifts in worship. But in looking at this, we can also gain some insight and some knowledge on how we can conduct or should conduct our worship service here, today. Verse 26, we did talk about this verse, but we'll go ahead and read it again just to kind of set the basis for our study this morning. He says, How is it then, brethren, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. And so, as we said last week, the remainder of this chapter is going to be some guidelines for the assemblies, for how they should conduct their assembly, some very specific things that he tells them in the next verses that we will study. But the conclusion that Paul is reaching is that the worship service is a time that should benefit those who are gathered. Let all things be done for edification. And so anything that is being done within the worship service, it should be for the building up, the edification of those who are assembled. It's not a time, as we have said, to show off, to exhibit spiritual gifts really to no particular end other than just building up the person that is performing that spiritual gift. So everything done in worship should be geared toward building up and strengthening those who are gathered. And so now we're going to be getting into some very specific examples where this principle of edification in worship should be applied. Before we get into that, does anybody have anything they want to say or add to anything that we've studied so far? So as we get into some of the specifics, he's going to give some guidelines on speaking in tongues. So, edifying with tongues, if it's going to be done with edification, and this is how it needs to be done. And so if we look at verses 27 and 28, it says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be 2 or at the most 3, each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in church, and let him speak to himself and God. And so there we have some very specific instructions about the use of speaking in tongues in the worship service. The first thing that we can notice there is that there is a limit to how much tongue speaking should be done in the worship service. So when speaking in another language here, the assumption is, as we've said before, is that this is a language that most, if not all, of the people gathered together cannot understand. And so that is why, it's not necessarily edifying to the congregation, because the things that are being said are not understood. And so when you have someone getting up, speaking in a tongue, and of course this is an ability that has been given to them by the Spirit, when they begin doing this, when most of the congregation can't understand, then there should only be 2 or 3 at the most that would do that in the assembly. So, there's no benefit if the whole service is given over to speaking in tongues, because, there again, the congregation can't understand what's going on. Communication really in a worship service is the primary need. And that's what we, anytime that we lead worship, communication is key. And of course, a very strong part of communicating is your audience understanding you. I mean, that really is the main part. And so if the audience cannot understand, then, communication begins to break down. So we need to understand that because this communication is key, then you should only have one person speaking at a time. From my understanding, these denominations who claim to be, where people speak in tongues, I believe there are several people at one time speaking in tongues. And so they don't follow this example as well. So it should only be one person speaking at a time, so that that communication can be a part of the service there. Otherwise it's just going to be chaos and confusion. And this not only in speaking in tongues, but really in any part of our worship service, one person speaking at a time. I can remember listening on the radio, the people that used, maybe they still come on. I listen online now to the radio program, but people that used to come on after the radio program, they'd start leading in prayer, and then you'd have the whole, maybe 10 people all praying at the same time, and you couldn't even understand what was going on. I mean, to me, that was just a waste of airspace because nobody could understand. And, really that's very foolish, especially in light of what we can read here and instructions that Paul is giving here. Anybody have anything they'd like to add there? So limit the use of tongues. They should keep silent if there's no interpreter. And when you look up the definition for the word silent, it basically just means don't speak. Keep your mouth shut. If there's nobody there to interpret what you're saying, then you simply do not speak, because there would be no use. No one would be able to understand, and there would be no information that is being given to anybody. There would be, no profit. I was thinking about this in connection to, and I'm not sure if they still do it. I know they used to do it a lot. The Catholic denomination, how that many times, or at least in the past, maybe like I said, still is, some of their services, not a lot of their services, were done in Latin, where the people gathered did not understand it, but yet they were performing and reading in Latin and things of that nature. And so to me, really what's the use in that? And I believe this here also would condemn that practice of denominations leading services in another language that the congregation does not understand. There's just no profit, no justification for it. And so, as we said, our services should edify. And I think all of us in here understand, the things that we have just discussed as far as multiple people speaking at the same time, speaking in a language that the congregation doesn't understand, and things of that nature. But at the conclusion of our lesson last week, I said, or I asked for you to kind of be thinking of maybe some things that, other than this, that we could do, or things that could be done in our worship service that would not edify. And I think it's important for us to think about those things and make sure that we are conducting our services in a way that are going to edify. And so I've got a couple here, and maybe you've got some more that you'd like to add, and I'd like to hear any comments that anybody would like to make on this. But one thing I would suggest is, sometimes, we might make a comment or ask a question that maybe we've got the wrong motive for. Maybe the comment or the question is asked just to, stir up strife or for some personal reason, or maybe it's a comment that I'm going to make just to brag on myself and maybe show my ability off or something like that. Maybe, that's kind of the purpose behind it, and really that's the only thing coming from that. But it doesn't really edify the congregation. It mainly maybe glorifies me, or maybe it stirs up strife or something like that. And so I think that we need to be careful, anytime we present a lesson, anytime we make a comment, anytime we lead a prayer, I think it's key, as we've said before, to edify. And if the things that we are saying or asking are not things that are going to edify the congregation, then we need to do like the tongue speaker without an interpreter, and we need to keep our mouths shut. And we need to be very careful about that. Anybody have any comments, agree or disagree with that? Yeah, devil's advocate. Sometimes we might can do that to maybe prove a point, but just doing that just to for other reasons is very dangerous there. So good point. Anything else there? Another thing that I think it was Brandy, we were talking about this, maybe saying amen too frequently. And there again, I want to preface this with saying that I think there's nothing wrong with a man, the preacher says something or something like that you agree with, someone saying amen. And actually, I really appreciate it. Because when I'm preaching or I'm teaching and, maybe it's a point and a man says amen to it, it encourages me because I know I've connected. And so I really, really like that, to know that the audience is engaged. But you take someone who's doing that constantly, multiple times during a service, and that's not really going to edify, really, to me. Maybe that's a little too much. So that's another thing we might be doing. I don't know if this. There's a lot of things surrounding this next one that maybe we could discuss, but clapping during singing. There's a lot wrong with that, but certainly I don't think clapping edifies. And so that might be something that might slip in on us. What's the purpose of that? It's not really for edification, is it? Another one might be, in a setting such as this or in the worship service, we begin discussing the temperature that the thermostat is set on, or maybe the color of the new carpet that we're going to be putting in, or things like that. Those type things don't edify, and there's a time and place that those things should be discussed, but not in worship service. That's not the time for that. The time for that's another time, because those don't really edify. And so those are some things that I came up with. Does anybody have anything else that might slip in on us that we might need to avoid there?
And I think we can all be guilty of this. Making a comment from the class is prolonging that comment, and where you take over the class and you become the teacher from the seat.
Yeah.
We need to be careful about that. Even though we may be making a good comment, we need to remember who's in charge of the class, and he has things prepared to present. And let the one that has much to say discuss it with the class teacher, and let the class teacher pursue that next time if he chooses to do so.
Okay.
And Brother Sutton said, you know, you're the class teacher's in charge, you know, take charge.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
Shane,
Yeah.
I would say using too much humor, maybe in a message. I've been places before where, you know, the man presenting, I mean, he just had the congregation just rolling, laughing constantly.
Yeah.
And to me, I didn't think it was all that funny because I'm trying to focus, I'm trying to glean what I can and grow and really focus on what he's saying, you know, from the word. And, you know, it's just, I mean, that doesn't edify humor.
Yeah, that's a good comment as well. That bleeds over into entertainment, just like what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with the big bands and things like that. You know, you're entertained and not edified, and there's a difference. Entertainment lasts for a moment. Edification will last. It will keep lasting. You know, it's just like you go in, or you watch a movie or hear a song, or, you know, maybe something that brings you to tears or something. You know, you're sad, but then you walk out and, you know, you're happy again. It doesn't last. You know, that emotion was short-lived because it's not true edification. It's just entertainment. And so that's a good point there, Jared. Anything else? I think it's important that we discuss these things, that we recognize that these things can creep in, because, you know, Satan's got all the time in the world. And so he can spend years working on a congregation and letting these little things slip in, and before you know it, the congregation, you know, 10, 20, 30 years is just off the rails, because they began doing these small things that do not really edify. And the church then begins to starve. And before you know it, they're in a totally different place. All right, so kind of finishing up with tongues there. Like we said, very specific rules regarding using of tongues. Now we'll shift to edifying with prophecy. And so we'll read verses 29 through 33. So it begins there in verse 29, "Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others judge. If anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent, for you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." And so we see, you know, when it comes with prophecy as well, prophecy should not dominate the worship service, just like tongue speaking shouldn't. You know, even though it's more useful in the assembly than tongues, it should still be limited. Only 2 or 3 prophets should be able to speak during that service. And they should take turns speaking one at a time. Again, you know, God is not the author of confusion, so one person at a time speaking. Limit the prophets to only 2 or 3 per service. Another thing we see from this is the others should judge the prophets. When you read commentators, as far as, you know, what this actually means, it's debated whether the others here who are judging would be other prophets, or if it would be those in the assembly that would be judging. But, you know, really, I think both could be the case. I think there's an argument for both, but, you know, to me, the congregation as a whole could definitely judge what is being said and comparing it to other things that have already been revealed, maybe to other things that the apostles have told them and written to them about, and other things that previous prophets had said. You know, if it went against previous revelations, then definitely the thing that would be being said would be false. And so they could judge that. You look at the Christians in Berea, you know, look at what they did when Paul and Silas came in teaching them. There in Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 10, it says, "Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the Scriptures to find out whether these things were so. And so here you had the congregation at Berea, you had Paul, an apostle, and then Silas coming in, and they're teaching them things. Paul is teaching them things that had been revealed to him, but yet you have the Bereans going in, searching and making sure that nothing that is being said or taught is contradictory to anything else that has already been revealed. And so without a doubt, the congregation there at Corinth could do the same as these prophets were speaking these different prophecies. You know, trying the spirits is a biblical thing, and it's very biblical. You look at 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." And so we see that false prophets were rampant at that time and are really still rampant today. So we need to be trying the spirits. Back when there were men actually prophesying, you know, it was an obligation of the Christians then in the first century to try those spirits as well. And so they needed to judge whether or not these things were so. 1 Thessalonians 5 verses 20 and 21, it says, "Do not despise prophecies, test all things, hold fast what is good." And so here again, we have a command to try the prophecies, to test the spirits, to make sure that the things that are being said line up with things that have already been said. And so, you know, judging a prophet is very scriptural. And, you know, even today, when we speak to someone and they start maybe questioning our, you know, where we're coming from, or maybe our authority to say this is right or wrong or whatever, you know, they question that, you know, we shouldn't be offended. Because we should test, we should judge everything that everyone is telling us to make sure it's right. It's a biblical principle. And we should never be offended when someone wants to see the verse. They want us to prove, you know, why do you have authority to do that? Show me where you have that authority. That should not offend us. We should be more than willing to do that. Any comments or anything along those lines?
Shane, all this is sort of inspired and uninspired, right?
Yeah. I think in the congregation, you know, not everybody at Corinth had spiritual gifts, and they weren't all the same. So you would definitely, you know, this would be written toward, like you said, inspired and uninspired, and so we can then learn the same as what the uninspired people at Corinth can learn from it. Any other comments? Another thing we see is that if a prophet who is not speaking receives a message from God, the current speaker is to yield the floor to them. And, you know, we go back, and I should have put this back up on the screen there. So, you know, there in verse 31 it says, For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not the author of confusion. So, you know, there's a lot of false doctrine on that phrase, the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. But when you look at the context and everything that's going on here, and, you know, what's being said around that, you know, basically he's saying one person at a time, and, you know, the spirit is subject to the prophet, which means that a prophet's not going to get a revelation and then uncontrollably start speaking. he has the ability to hold his peace until there's an orderly time for him to speak. He has control over that. It's not going to be something where he's going to get this revelation and then he has to speak and there's no stopping him. And he's just going to start blurting out. Paul says he has control over his spirit. And so he can hold that in. If God gives another a message, so you've got a prophet that's speaking in the congregation. And, maybe this prophecy, there's nothing saying that he didn't get this prophecy maybe 2 or 3 days earlier. Maybe he got it right before the assembly started. We don't know. But anyway, he's speaking this prophecy. And then you have another member in the congregation that receives that prophecy, that receives another prophecy right then. Well, the person that is speaking this prophecy that he had received previously is to yield the floor to the other one that had just received the prophecy. Now, I don't know what that looks like as far as, we're not given any specifics on how that other person was to let him know that he had received another prophecy. We don't know. But what we do know is it was to be done in an orderly manner. And it was to be done so that it edified everybody there. So maybe it was just as simple as raising your hand and saying, brother, I've got this prophecy that I just received. And so the one speaking then yields the floor to him. And so as we said before, very orderly, nothing, no chaos, no one is dominating the other. Each person is taking a turn. And, it's done in a way that people can understand. There's no need for one person to talk over another person, to talk somebody down, because everybody is taking turns and doing so in an orderly fashion. And so, these people have, like we said, have control over their spirits. And again, it seems like this goes against, or it does go against what I've seen on television and heard on radio programs and stuff, what a lot of the denominations do today, where they act like that they have no control over their spirit and they just go crazy and start jumping up and running and yelling and things like that. And we can see that definitely is not scriptural. That if God is working on me in some way, the Spirit is working on me, I'm going to have the ability to control my actions. And I'm not going to have to get up and scream and yell and run and stuff like that. So definitely that's what Paul is teaching here. Any comments or anything on that? I didn't advance my slides there. All right, so in conclusion, on this section, we see that God does not create confusion. No, God is not the author of confusion. What does the author do? Well, the author creates confusion. He creates. And so God does not create confusions. And so in giving people these gifts, He's not therefore creating a situation where there's going to be confusion. Paul is stating that there's no reason to have chaos in the worship service. There's a reason why God wants only one person at a time to address the assembly. There's a reason why God limits tongue speaking to only 3 people. There's a reason why God enables a man to control himself when he's under the direction of the Spirit. And that reason is because He is not a God of confusion. He does not create confusion. There must be some measure of order to the assembly. The assemblies must be in order. And I believe this is very important. This does not, however, totally limit spontaneity. There's a certain amount, I believe, of spontaneity that can be done during or for a worship service. You know, it's easy to go to both extremes. You know, maybe there's an issue which needs to be addressed. Maybe, you know, right before services or earlier in the day, somebody was in an accident or you know, somebody got a bad report from the doctor, and as we're coming in, you know, the elders decide, well, tonight we're doing a prayer, you know, we're going to pray tonight. We're going to have a prayer service. You know, all that can be done in order. Is not what we usually do on Wednesday night, but yet there's nothing wrong with that. You know, we spontaneously, you know, just kind of decide tonight there needs to be prayer for this brother or sister. And that's okay. Another thing I can remember several years ago when Brother Glenn Robertson's father was baptized. If you remember being here then, you know, it was a situation where you know, having, you know, it was a little bit of trouble getting him into the baptistry and things like that. And so, you know, basically that entire Sunday evening service was devoted to his baptism. We sang, he was baptized, we prayed. You know, there was no preaching done. And that was kind of on the moment, you know, in the moment kind of thing that was changed. It was important that he was baptized, and there were things that were having to be done because of that. And so, but it was all in order. Those of you who were here, I think you remember, it was done in order. And there was nothing wrong with that. And so we can be spontaneous in a way, but yet be orderly as well. And so I don't think we need to go to the other extreme to say, well, we've never had a prayer service on Wednesday night, therefore, you know, we can't have it. You know, we change up when we partake of the Lord's Supper for a reason. You know, as long as it's done in order and for the right reason, I don't think that's an issue. Maybe we need to sing 5 songs. Maybe there's a reason why something's going on and we need to sing more songs than what we usually do. Well, that's fine. We can do that. Maybe we sing a song at the end of service before we close out in prayer. You know, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It's okay, as long as it's done in order. Any comments or anything along those lines? God is a God of peace, and we must worship Him in peace. We must worship Him in order. And I think that is, you know, one of the main things we can take from the passages that we've studied this morning. All right, we kind of shift gears a little bit here as we go into verses 34 and 35, and I do not expect to get this issue covered this morning. I'm sure that there's going to be some comments, maybe even some questions. If you've got anything that you would like for me to address in particular next week, feel free to let me know, and I'll do my best to address, you know, any aspect of that. But you know, what we're getting into here is the you know, women speaking out in the services. And so this, of course, has been a problem for years in denominations, and it's beginning to be more of a problem in the Lord's church. You know, there are things that are being done now, things that, you know, we have witnessed firsthand that are you know, easing these churches into being just like the other denominations. And so we're going to discuss this. Like we said, if you have any questions, feel free to ask those privately. You know, I can study on those and present some things next week. You know, if anything specifically that you want me to address there. And so, you know, one thing we need to say as we as we get into this, and I think it goes without saying, and I think everybody here understands this, is that, we do not view women as being any less important to the work here as any man. Our ladies here are very important. I have respect for the ladies here and the work that they do. And without the ladies, then this congregation would not be what it is, where it is, and they are just so important. But what we need to understand is God has a way He wants things done. And we have to follow that, and He has His reasons for that. And that does not make women any less of a Christian. It's just the way that God wants it done. And He has His reasons, and everybody's important. And we need to love and respect everyone. And so we don't have a lot of time, but we'll just kind of get into it just a little bit there. Verses 34 and 35 says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. But they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in the church." So as we begin here, and to kind of follow up with what I was just saying, as we look throughout the New Testament, we can see that women were definitely involved in the early church. And they have things that they were to do then and things that they are still to do now. And so we see that women were very involved. We see that it was foretold that women would prophesy. In Acts chapter 2, verses 15 through 18, there was this prophecy that women, or it was foretold that women would prophesy. And so back then, just like the men had the ability to prophesy back when spiritual gifts were in effect, there were also ladies that were able to prophesy as well. And so you have female prophets. We see where Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied in Acts chapter 21. And so there were 4 ladies in the same household who had this ability to prophesy. We see where instructions were given for women to prophesy. Back when we studied 1 Corinthians chapter 11, there, when talking about the head covering, there were special instructions given there for women who were prophesying. We see in Acts chapter 18 where Aquila helped her husband to teach Apollos. And so she was involved in that teaching or that education of this man who went on to later do great things. And so she was involved in that. We see in Titus 2, verses 3 through 5, where older women are commanded to teach the younger women. And so there's a very important obligation that older women have to instruct and to teach and to encourage the younger women. And so we see that the limits that God places on the females in the assemblies do not limit their ability to work for Him, in different aspects. And there are many ways, and we could probably spend 2 or 3 different lessons speaking about all the things that ladies could do, the way they encourage, the encouragement that ladies have given me all throughout my life. I mean, that role is very important. And, many of us men would not be where we are at if it was not for the ladies. Or I'd say all of us would not be. And so that role is very important for women to fulfill. Yet we see that the Scriptures clearly place limitations on women in the worship service. We saw in the passage that we just read in verses 34 and 35 where there are clear limitations placed upon women. We also can see in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, where it says, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, but to be in silence." And so, there are limitations placed on women, and we can't ignore those. We can't ignore those because our society has changed. We can't ignore those because it's not politically correct. We can't ignore those things because, somebody's going to maybe create a Facebook post about us and blast us as being ignorant and archaic in our beliefs. We can't ignore these things because they're very, very clearly written in the Scriptures. And so my endeavor, Lord willing, next week is to take a look at these and to the best of my ability, try to discuss why, we have these and all the things, what does this require? When does this apply? Reasons why this applies, to kind of fully discuss these things so that we have a better understanding as far as this instruction to the ladies to keep silent. So, like I said, if you have anything in particular you want me to discuss, a certain question or something that you want me to address, feel free to let me know, and I'll do my best to do that. I appreciate everybody's attention and participation, and we'll go ahead and close up our class.